First of all, very well done for getting here. I am both delighted and honoured to introduce the final speaker of our three-day Festival of Ideas. Peter Tatchell has been at the forefront of fighting for LGBTQ rights since the late 1960s. That is over 5 decades of involvement in this area. And I'm not going to say too much because I know he's going to talk about the work he has done. But one thing I did want to start off by saying, and this struck me as I was thinking about this talk, is that when I was your age, sitting in this sort of an audience, it would not have been legal to have the talk that we are going to have today. And that, believe it or not, was not that long ago. And so I hope that gives some context to what Peter is going to talk about. And so without further ado, could I ask you to give an enormous welcome to Peter Tatchell.
Well, as you heard, I have been campaigning for human rights in general and for LGBT plus rights for 52 years. I began as a teenager, about your age, way back in the 1960s. But nothing in my family life prepared me for doing this work. I was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1952 to a very conservative, working class family. Our family was deeply, deeply religious. They were sort of probably borderline Christian fundamentalists, evangelicals. They were unconcerned about social issues, about community action, about human rights. But somehow or other, I changed. And I think that the pivotal event that influenced me happened in 1963 when I was 11 years old. I read about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young black girls about my age were murdered in a white racist terror attack. I remember thinking to myself as an 11-year-old, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on a Sunday morning? And that prompted my interest in the Black Civil Rights Movement. I was inspired by their struggle for African American freedom. Now, of course, in those days, in the southern United States, there was widespread segregation. Black people had to sit at the back of the bus. There were certain carriages on trains reserved for white people only. There were beaches and parks where black people were prohibited. It was a bit like apartheid South Africa. And also, in that era, black people were very heavily restricted in terms of their ability to vote. So to register to vote, you had to pass a citizenship test. And for black voters, the citizenship test was so extreme, so complicated, required such knowledge that most people, black or white, could not pass it. So the Black Civil Rights Movement was about challenging and overturning those twin discriminations of segregation and voter suppression. I didn't actually do my first campaign until I was 15 in 1967. That was a campaign against the death penalty. In my hometown of Melbourne, Australia, and indeed in the state of Victoria, there was still capital punishment. And a man was due to be hanged for allegedly shooting dead a prison warder during a jail escape. At the age of 15, I read a summary of the autopsy report on the dead warder's body. And I worked out that from where the alleged killer stood when he fired the fatal shot, and where the warder stood when he was hit by that fatal bullet, it was almost physically impossible, because the bullet would have almost had to do a U-turn in midair to have inflicted that wound. So that prompted me to get involved in the campaign to try and save his life. Sadly, we did not succeed. He was hanged anyway. And that really destroyed my trust and confidence in the government, the police, and the judiciary. I thought to myself, there is at least a reasonable doubt that this man fired that fatal shot, yet he was hanged anyway. That is not justice. So it made me a lifelong skeptic of authority. And I began to question many other things which I'd either taken for granted or had been ignorant about. So in Australia, the Indigenous peoples, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, had been forced out of all the city areas and lived in remote, isolated areas. I never saw an Aboriginal person in all my childhood, because they had out on reservations, way out of the city. And I began to question the way in which Aboriginal people had been treated. When the first English settlers went to Australia, it's estimated there were somewhere between 500,000 and 750,000 Indigenous black Australians. By the 1920s, there were only about 120,000 left. That was a genocide. And I was horrified when I learned the truth. So I began supporting the campaign for Aboriginal civil and human rights. Also at that time, Australia was fighting alongside America in the Vietnam War. And as a young kid, I bought the propaganda that this was a crusade against communism. We were told, if we don't stop the communists in Vietnam, they'll come and invade Australia. Clearly that was nonsense, but I didn't know that until I started reading the history. So I understood and eventually learned about how in Vietnam there had been the promise of free and fair elections in 1954. But the United States vetoed those elections and supported a dictatorship in the southern half of Vietnam to prevent what they saw as a likely victory by communists. Communists had fought against Japan to liberate Vietnam and other countries in the region from Japanese occupation. So there's huge support for the communists. But anyway, whatever, I thought it was wrong that America had stopped those elections and had sent in troops to prop up a right-wing dictatorship which was committing human rights abuses. So I got involved in the anti-war activities. It wasn't until 1969, when I was 17, that I realized I was gay. And I'd never heard of the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969. But in late 1969, I did read a report about a subsequent gay liberation protest in New York. I think I recall the newsroom brief in the local paper just said something like, "Thousands of homosexuals marched through New York last night to demand civil rights." That's basically all it said. And I thought to myself, yes, that is what we need. That is what I want to be part of. I've been fighting for Aboriginal rights, against the Vietnam War, against capital punishment. Now this is an issue that affected me. Now, in those days, homosexuality was totally illegal in the state of Victoria and every other state in Australia. You could be punished with several years' imprisonment. You could even be sentenced to have compulsory psychiatric treatment. There were no public figures who were openly gay. There were no counselling services, no helplines, nothing. So I remember thinking to myself, like the people in New York, we need here in Melbourne, Australia, an LGBT plus movement to end criminalisation, to ensure equality. I remember going around to the few gay people I knew and suggesting we set up an LGBT plus organisation. They all looked at me in horror. They said to me, "Oh, what do you know? You're only 17 years old. You'll get us all arrested. Go away." So all I could do was write letters to the newspapers, urging decriminalisation and challenging homophobic reporting. Initially, I sent them completely anonymously because I was afraid that the letters might be handed to the police and that I might be arrested. But over time, I eventually signed my name, and then a few months after that, I began signing my name and address. Now, I don't know if those letters had much effect. Probably not. But it wasn't until 1971, when I came to Britain, age 19, that I was able to get involved in the newly formed London Gay Liberation Front. This was the first mass movement in Britain of LGBT plus people. For the first time, thousands of LGBT plus people came out, were open about their sexuality, and began challenging the homophobia of the government, the police, the judiciary, the church, the media, and so on. It was a very, very, very exciting time because we were doing something completely new. You know, we had a little three-word slogan, "Gay is good." 3 words, but those 3 powerful words turned on their head the traditional orthodoxy that gay was bad, mad, and sad. And so the Gay Liberation Front really kick-started the modern movement for LGBT plus rights in this country. We not only wanted our liberation, we wanted to support others who were also fighting for their rights. So we joined with the women's liberation movement, the black liberation movement, the Irish liberation movement, and the struggles of working class people for social equality and justice. We believed that if we all worked together, we would be stronger. Back in those days, it was very, very difficult to make any progress. Parliament was so homophobic, they wouldn't even dare debate LGBT plus rights. They said it was disgusting, foul, and unacceptable to even discuss the issue in the Houses of Parliament. That's how homophobic it was. Even back then in the early 70s, there was not a single openly gay person in this country. No politicians, no pop stars, no TV entertainers, no sports people. Nobody was openly gay because of the scale of homophobia. Until the mid-1970s in this country, you could be pressured or sometimes sentenced by the courts to undergo what was called, quote, aversion therapy. And this involved you being strapped in a chair, strapped in, tied down, locked down in a chair. You had electrodes applied all over your body. And then you were shown images, if you're a man, of naked men, or if you're a woman, of naked women. And every time an image appeared, you were given an electric shock. And this was on the National Health Service, paid for by the taxpayer. It was a lesser version of what the Nazis tried to do when they came to power in Germany. Their goal was also to cure and eradicate homosexuality. Their tactic was, of course, to put gay men and bisexual men in concentration camps, and sometimes doing experiments on them, gruesome, ugly experiments on them. Incidentally, the main doctor who did those experiments in Nazi concentration camps on gay and bisexual men, his name was Karl Warnet, a member of the SS. He should have been put on trial as a war criminal, like the doctors who experimented on Jewish people and disabled people and Roma and Sinti people. But the Allies thought that he was doing a good thing, that the eradication of homosexuality was a worthy, laudable goal. So he was never put on trial. He was allowed to escape to Argentina and live openly for 2 more decades. Even when it was reported to the Nazi war crime investigators, to the Allies who were investigating Nazi war crimes, even when it was reported to them that he was living openly in Argentina and listing his crimes, they did nothing. So it shows the scale of homophobia that existed in the post-war period. I can remember in the late 1970s proposing the idea of a comprehensive Equality Act to protect everyone against discrimination and to guarantee equal treatment, based on gender, race, disability, sexuality, age, and so on. Because in those days, there was no equality law. There was a race equality law, that's true, and there was a gender equality law, that's true. They were not adequate, but they were in the right direction. But I want to strengthen those laws and expand them to protect everyone. I was told that was extremist. And in fact, when I stood for Labour as a parliamentary candidate in the Bermondsey by-election in 1983, I was told, don't mention this. This is too extreme. To propose an Equality Act to protect everyone, the tabloid newspapers will have a field day, our opponents will criticize us. You can't say that. It wasn't until 2010 that my proposals from 1978 eventually became law. And they now, of course, protect you and protect everyone. In the battle for LGBT plus rights, I've sometimes had to use provocative methods. I mentioned that I was inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States. For decades, they had tried to lobby the president and Congress and got nowhere. So Martin Luther King and others organized a campaign of nonviolent, direct action, and civil disobedience to challenge the laws that penalized African Americans. And so those tactics did work. So for example, a friend of mine, his mother was in the Black Civil Rights Movement. Her local beach in Savannah, Georgia was designated as white people only. Black people had to go further up the coast to a black-only beach. So she, having lobbied the state legislature to end the ban and got nowhere, she and others went to that white beach and swam in defiance of the law and got arrested. They did it several times. It got huge media coverage, and in the end, the embarrassment and shame forced the state authorities to end that whites-only beach. So I could see very clearly that these tactics worked. And so I adapted them to the battle for LGBT plus rights. The Church of England has been notoriously homophobic, and still is. So in 1994, together with my colleagues from the LGBT plus group Outrage, we outed 10 Anglican bishops. Not because they were gay and in the closet, but because they were homophobic and hypocritical. They were saying one thing in public and doing something different in private. You know, they were either actively denouncing and opposing equality, they were either being gay or having had gay sexual relations in the past. We thought that double standard was intolerable. We thought it was intolerable that they were part of a church that was persecuting us without themselves making any distance or in any way criticizing that church. So we stood on the steps of the General Synod, naming them and called on them to tell the truth. After all, on a Sunday morning, they urged their congregants to tell the truth. But they weren't telling the truth. And they were aligned with the church that was persecuting LGBT plus people. The effect of that naming of those bishops was very dramatic. First of all, as far as I know, none of those bishops ever again spoke out against LGBT rights. In fact, some of them eventually began to speak out in support of equality. Furthermore, because of the huge furore in the church, the hypocrisy being exposed, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, agreed to establish a liaison with the lesbian and gay community for the very first time. And indeed, some other bishops spoke out in support of equal rights for LGBT plus people. So that was 3 wins from that protest. Those wins would not have happened without the catharsis, the catalyst of us naming those bishops. 4 years later, we did something similar. The then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, was actively lobbying members of the House of Lords and House of Commons to vote against gay equality. He opposed an equal age of consent. He opposed any recognition of same-sex relationships. He opposed the right of same-sex couples to foster or adopt children. He said employers in certain circumstances should have the right to discriminate against LGBT employees, including not hiring them or indeed even firing them. So we had tried for 8 years to meet him. He wouldn't even meet us. He wouldn't even meet members of the lesbian and gay Christian movement who were part of his own Anglican church. So faced with that intransigence, we decided we would go and meet him. And where better than on Easter Sunday in his own cathedral. When the event was televised, we would name and shame him. So we went down to Canterbury for that Easter Sunday service in 1998. And when George Carey finished his sacred parts of the service and began his political speech, his sermon, commenting on the topical issues of the day, we got up out of our seats and calmly walked to the pulpit. We walked into the pulpit. I remember he was in full flow and I came up and stood beside him. He looked rather startled when he saw me, but he stepped to one side and gave me the pulpit. And I began an alternative sermon, basically arguing that discrimination was not a Christian value. Now, of course, being a major civic occasion, in the front row in the cathedral were, the council leader and leading local officials, including the chief constable and some of his officers. So they got up out of their seats and walked around. I saw them walking around, obviously to try and remove me and my outraged colleagues from the pulpit and the steps. I just ignored them, but I got very, very nervous. I grabbed onto the pulpit to steady myself because I was quite nervous. I was a bit shaking a bit. And then the next thing I know, these big pair of hefty arms grabbed me around the waist and yanked me backwards. And I was holding on to this beautiful 13th century pulpit, and of course it came to pieces in my hand. I was then arrested, taken to Canterbury Police Station, where I spent the next 6.5 hours while the police debated what they would charge me with. They were going to charge me with criminal damage to the pulpit. But as I explained to them, the whole event was televised worldwide. Everyone would see that I hadn't deliberately damaged the pulpit. It had been caused by the police officer yanking me backwards without warning. So they dropped that idea, and then scratching their heads, they couldn't come up with anything to charge me with. So I was bailed to return, and a few weeks later I was told I was going to be charged with, quote, indecent behaviour in a church, contrary to the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551. I hasten to add that I did not drop, the charge was indecent behaviour. I did not drop my trousers. But under that law, any interruption of a minister of religion in a church is deemed to be indecent. So when it came to my trial, the magistrate said, well, you know, the law is very clear. There are no exemptions, no qualifications, no excuses. If you interrupt the minister of religion, you are committing a crime. He could have fined me £5,000 and sent me to prison for 6 months. Instead, his penalty was a fine of, quote, £18.60. His comical reference to the 1860 Act under which I had been charged and convicted. That is to this day my only standing conviction out of over 3,000 protests, more than half of them involving non-violent direct action and civil disobedience. I've been arrested over 100 times, but only one standing conviction. I've done many other things in different ways as well. So in 2002, Mike Tyson was due to fight for the world title against the British boxer Lennox Lewis. And in the run-up to the fight, Tyson made a whole series of homophobic statements implying that Lennox Lewis was gay and that he was pathetic and whatever. I thought to myself, he shouldn't be allowed to get away with this. So I flew to Memphis, Tennessee, where the world title fight was taking place. I didn't know how to get in contact with Mike Tyson to challenge him, but I reasoned that in the run-up to the fight, he must be working out and training at a gym. And I read in one of the local papers that he was staying in a suburb on the outskirts of Memphis. So I did a search on the internet and found that not far from where he was staying, there was a gym, the 650 gym. And I reasoned, well, that was possibly the gym where he was going to be training. So on a Sunday morning, with a couple of local gay activists in Memphis, I lay in wait outside the gym. When I arrived, I saw there were some TV crews and journalists. So immediately my heart soared. I thought, well, there can only be here for one reason. Hopefully Mike Tyson will turn up this morning. And sure enough, about half an hour later, he did. And as he got out of his black SUV, I strode over to him and challenged him on why he was being homophobic. He was very startled and surprised. And remember, he lifted his fist as though he was about to punch me. And then he realized there were all these TV crews around, put his fist away, but started remonstrating. I'm not homophobic, I'm not homophobic. In the end, we had a discussion. And I said to him, well, if you're not homophobic, say something that you support the LGBT plus community. And he did. To his credit, Mike Tyson said on the public record, the first and only boxer that I can remember doing this at the time, he said he opposed anti-gay discrimination. Brilliant. No other boxer ever said that, not even Lennox Lewis. So that was a win. And of course, afterwards, because we challenged him, he stopped all that homophobic ranting. Another example, in the run-up to the Iraq War, in 2003, I was very much against the Iraq War and felt that Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, who was going to take us into war, should be challenged. So I heard that he was going to meet Gerhard Schroeder, the then German Chancellor, at the Royal Academy. So I found out the time and the date and lay in wait in Piccadilly, assuming he'd come along Piccadilly to the Royal Academy. I lay in wait in a gift shop not far away from the Royal Academy, where I had a sight line further up the street. So when I could see the blue lights of the police escort coming, I just walked out of this gift shop, straight across the road, and let the first car go past, because that's usually a police escort with plainclothes police in it, and then ran straight in front of the next car, which was Tony Blair's limousine, and forced it to halt. It came to a halt about 6 or 9 inches from my legs. Then I pulled out a placard, not a machine gun, a placard from my back, opposing the Iraq War. I remember seeing Tony Blair in the back seat rolling his eyes. But the bodyguards in the car that had gone forward hadn't realized what had happened, so they kept on driving into the Royal Academy. The bodyguards in the following car couldn't see what was going on. So I was there for about a minute, it seemed like an eternity, while I was holding up this placard and shouting against the Iraq War. Eventually, the bodyguards jumped out of the second car and proceeded to try and remove me. But I wasn't going to go lightly, so I held on to the underside of the chassis of his car. And there were like 4 or 5 of them pulling my arms and legs, trying to drag me away. But you can see I'm quite skinny and everything, but I had quite incredible strength. They took about a minute and a half to eventually yank me away. And as they did, my fingernails clipped the Prime Minister's number plate, and the 3 screws popped out, and it was left dangling by 1 screw. Anyway, I was then taken away, and I spent the next few hours in Vine Street Police Station. I was bailed to return, and then they decided not to proceed with any charges. They probably thought that it wasn't worth giving me the publicity of a court trial. Another thing that I did, you may have heard of, is that I'd been a supporter of the Zimbabwe liberation movement led by Robert Mugabe when they were seeking to overthrow white minority rule. Zimbabwe used to be called Rhodesia. It was a former British colony. It had an apartheid-style regime where black people were not allowed to vote, where there was segregation and discrimination against Africans. I was asked by human rights defenders in Zimbabwe to try and do something to highlight Mugabe's human rights abuses. So I hit on the idea of using the power of citizen's arrest to get Mugabe put on trial for torture, because I had evidence that he had authorized and condoned the torture of opposition activists in Zimbabwe. Of course, I'd tried beforehand to get governments to arrest him, because under international law, torture is a crime. Any government official, any state official who condones, authorizes, commits, or acquiesces in acts of torture can be put on trial anywhere in a country that has signed the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Britain had signed it. Belgium had signed it. Many countries had signed it. So when I heard that Robert Mugabe was going to go on a state visit to Belgium, which is basically all about aid and trade, I decided that he should be challenged. So I got a tip-off from a journalist that he was going to be meeting the European Commissioner in the Hilton Hotel in Brussels for lunch, at about 12 noon, and that he would then go on to meet the Belgian Prime Minister at his residence at 3 o'clock. So I reasoned that at some point between 12 and 3, Mugabe would have to come out of the hotel to travel to the Belgian Prime Minister's residence. So I lay in wait in the Hilton Hotel, trying to look an inconspicuous tourist. Coming about, it was about 2:30, I think, he still hadn't shown. I wondered if perhaps he'd been smuggled out the back, but no. I thought, well, hang around, just wait. He may only come out, very close to 3 o'clock. Sure enough, That's what he did. So I had positioned myself in a boutique in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel in Brussels by the exit. And from where I was standing, I had a good view of the whole lobby, which was reflected in the plate glass windows of the hotel. I didn't want to show my face because I previously tried to arrest Mugabe in London in 1999 and previously confronted him 2 years previously at an Africa conference, also in London. So I was afraid that he or his bodyguards might recognize me. So the important thing was to keep my face hidden until the last minute. So I think come about 2:40, 2:45, President Mugabe and his retinue come out of the lifts and begin to walk through the very long lobby in the Hilton Hotel. I had a perfect view reflected in the plate glass window, but they couldn't see my face. All they were seeing was the back of my head. When I saw that his retinue had drawn parallel with this boutique, I then stumbled out like a clumsy tourist into the middle of his entourage and then smiled, beamed brightly and held up my hand to shake his hand. And of course, this disarmed his bodyguards. They thought I was a well-wisher. So I was allowed to go right into the middle and get right next to Mugabe. At which point I said, President Mugabe, you're under arrest on charges of torture. The next thing I know, I was grabbed by his bodyguards, dragged to the side of the hotel, and they started beating me around the head. There's some horrific footage. I think it's horrific. Horrific footage on YouTube of me being bashed around the head by those bodyguards. While they were beating me, his other bodyguards rushed him into the big revolving door that is the exit of the hotel to the street, and then tried to push it to make it go fast. And pushing it caused it to jam. So there's this comical situation of President Mugabe and 5 or 6 of his bodyguards stuck in this big revolving door. They screamed to the bodyguards beating me to come and help them release the door. So as they did that, I scampered out the fire exit and ran out into the pavement and stood on the street side of the revolving door. So here was the glass panel of the revolving door. Mugabe was on one side and I was on the other. We were only about maybe 2 feet apart. I was shouting at the top of my voice, Mugabe is a torturer, Mugabe is a murderer, arrest Mugabe. Then I was grabbed by the Belgian Secret Service agents. They slammed me up against the plate glass windows, and then when the revolving door was released, Mugabe's bodyguards came over and again started beating me. Then they were surrounded by journalists and TV crews and said, who are you? What authority are you using to beat this peaceful protester? While they were distracted talking to the journalists or fending off the journalists' questions, I scampered between their legs and ran out into the driveway just as President Mugabe's limousine was leaving and stood right in front of it. And then the bodyguards came over and I was really badly battered. I ended up being knocked unconscious. When I came to, the whole entourage had left. But undeterred, I thought, I know where he's going. This isn't over yet. So I got a lift to the Belgian Prime Minister's residence. And I stood outside, shouting at the top of my voice, and I'll give you a taste. I've got a very loud voice. Mugabe is a murderer! Mugabe is a torturer! Arrest Mugabe! They could hear me inside. The Belgian Prime Minister Mugabe could hear me inside. So after doing this for less than a minute, his bodyguards came out, and they reached inside their jackets. Meanwhile, Belgian police said, run, they've got guns. So I didn't question or argue or hesitate. I ran. The upshot was, of course, I did not succeed in arresting President Mugabe. But what happened to me that day made headlines all around the world. And a lot of people concluded, quite rightly, if President Mugabe is prepared to have his bodyguards beat unconscious a peaceful protester in the middle of a European capital city, in broad daylight, in front of TV crews, just imagine what he's doing to his own people when no one is watching. So it was a very effective, albeit unintended, expose of the tyranny of his regime. And in the weeks afterwards, in an era when email was not popular at all in Zimbabwe, not accessible in Zimbabwe, I received over 5,000 emails from people in Zimbabwe. And they nearly all said the same thing. We thought no one knew. We thought no one cared. You've given us hope. You didn't succeed, but you've brought international attention to the abuses by his regime. So Mugabe, as you know, stayed in power for much, much longer. But if he had been arrested, either in 1999, when I had him under arrest in London, I ambushed his motorcade, or if he'd been arrested in Brussels in 2001, then the worst excesses of his murderous regime, which happened from 2002 to 2006, those worst excesses may not have happened. So there's a few examples of some of the campaigns I've done. I was asked just briefly to give a summary of what next for LGBT plus rights here in the UK. Well, we have achieved tremendous achievements, tremendous gains in the last 2 decades. If you think about it, until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. Some of them dating back centuries. Yet by 2014, with the advent of same-sex marriage, every single one of those anti-LGBT plus laws had been repealed. That is the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. Never have so many laws discriminating against a minority community been repealed in such a short space of time. But we still have the fact that 1/3 of all LGBT plus people in this country have been victims of hate crime. That's nearly 1 million people. We still have the fact that in our schools, 45% of LGBT plus pupils say they've suffered bullying. Quite clearly, there is more work to be done. Right now, as you know, there are protests in Birmingham schools and elsewhere against LGBT inclusive education in school, led by Muslim extremists, supported by Christian and Jewish ones too. The idea that LGBT plus kids shouldn't be affirmed as to who they are, that their families should not be acknowledged, that is shocking. Those protesters, they would never ever accept schools denying the reality of their religious beliefs. Fact of religious belief should be taught in schools, and quite rightly. They want equal rights for Muslims, Jews, and Christians, but they're not prepared to give them to LGBT plus people. That is hypocrisy. So we still have a battle there, and the government's response has been very weak. They've issued vague statements saying that schools should be supported and have a right, but there's been no clear, strong condemnation of those protests and no clear, strong support for the schools that are being affected. We also have the fact that the promised reform to the Gender Recognition Act to allow transgender people to change their legal documents to reflect their true gender identity, that has now effectively been kicked into the long grass. Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, promised that reform would go ahead, but Boris Johnson, in his Queen's speech at the beginning of the week, did not include any commitment to gender recognition reform. We also have the situation where LGBT plus refugees fleeing persecution in countries like Uganda, Iran, Russia, and so on, they are often put in asylum detention centres. Some of them have escaped prison or escaped mob violence, and we put them in an asylum detention centre, which is effectively a prison by another name. And even those who are not imprisoned, they are banned from working, they are given accommodation in squalid, substandard Home Office hostels, and they're required to live on a mere £35 a week for all their food, travel, clothes, for everything. many of these people wait 3 or 5 years to get asylum. And all this time, they are forced to live on a mere £35 a week. They're condemned to destitution. This is completely immoral, and it's economic madness. Why should the taxpayer pay for their accommodation and their living expenses when they could be working? And they want to work. Of the refugees that I deal with, they are doctors, nurses, plumbers, carpenters, architects, teachers. They could be contributing to our economy, yet this crazy asylum system we have under this government prohibits them from working. So those are just a few of the issues that still need to be resolved. I'll just finish to say that I've done my bit. There's more to be done. You can do your bit too. As I said, I began at the age of 15. Nothing in my family background prepared me. I charted my own course. I'm just one of many. But we can all be change makers. And that's my challenge to you. Whatever course of life you decide to take, don't go along with the crowd. Be questioning, skeptical. Think for yourself. Do what is right rather than what is popular. Be a person who makes a difference. All your rights and freedoms that you enjoy were the result of previous generations fighting for those rights. I want you to be able to say in your life that you have contributed to making life better for future generations. We can all do that. Maybe you don't want to do things like crazy things like confronting Mike Tyson or ambushing President Mugabe, but there are things you can do in your own life that will and can make a difference. I'll finish with my motto, which is, don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to Peter for a very engaging, interesting, and comprehensive talk on his life and what challenges there are still to face. He's happy to take questions now, and so I'd like to open up the floor. Does anybody have any questions about any aspect of that or what we've considered today? Are you happy to pick people out? Or
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, okay.
How did your family react to you coming out today?
My family were very, very difficult. I knew that I couldn't just blurt out, I'm gay, partly because they were so deeply religious, they probably would have had a nervous breakdown, and I also feared they might turn me into the police. That's how zealous they were. So the tactic I used was what I call the drip, drip, drip effect. What I would do is, if there was something on the TV or on the paper about gay people, I'd say, you know, whatever you think about gay people, they should be live and let live. There shouldn't be laws against it, you know. Or sometimes I said, well, I was really angry that this person was sacked from their job for being gay. I decided to go on a protest with them. Over time, gradually, my parents put 2 and 2 together and came up with 4. So, in retrospect, they say that was the good way of doing it. They say that they admit they could not have coped if I had just come out at 17 straight away. So the drip, drip, drip effect was for them the easier way, because it enabled them to gradually, slowly come to terms with the idea that I was gay. So when I eventually did come out, yeah, there were some tears, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been. My parents, well, my father died, but my mother's still alive. She still believes that homosexuality is a sin, because she says so in the Bible. Even though I say to her, well, you're a Christian, you're a follower of Jesus Christ, he never said a word about homosexuality. But she still believes it's a sin. But she's now come around to the view that it's not a major sin, it's not like theft or murder or anything else. It's a minor sin when between consenting, loving adults. But she also has now come around to the view that homophobia is a sin. that discrimination, hatred against gay people is not compatible with the Christian gospel of love and compassion. So she supports my human rights work. And that's great because, she was very, very fire and brimstone. So there has been a transition there.
Are you still a Christian?
No. No, I for a whole host of reasons, partly because of the persecution of LGBT plus people at the church, but more broadly because of, to me, religion is a form of superstition. It's irrational. It's not a good way to understand the world. I think a scientific understanding is better. But of course, I respect people who have faith, and I defend people of faith who are persecuted. So I defend Muslims who are victimized. I defend Christians who are victimized. I defend people of all faiths who are victimized.
I see a lots of problem with our biological education. For example, we were taught that sex is decided by the sex chromosome, and you would struggle to change that in our current technological levels. And on legal documents, they're asking the category, at least for my Chinese passport, is sex instead of gender. So, in terms of support for the transgender community, we would struggle to see a change in the legal category of sex instead of gender. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, you're right. Sex and gender identity are different. But gender identity is about much more than genitals. Critics of the trans community say it's all about, what you've got down here. Gender is much more than that. Genitals are part of it, but so are chromosomes, so are hormones, so is the ability to reproduce, and so is our brains. And the latest research, there have been 2 or 3 studies in the last 2 years which have shown that the brains of transgender people are different from those of non-trans people. And that these differential brain structures are the likely source of their genuine, sincere belief that they were designated in the wrong gender. So I think whatever you think about trans people and issues yourself, I think we should adopt a live and let live attitude. There is no harm to be gained or no harm to be caused by acknowledging what trans people want, the affirmation of their true identity. And given the scale of prejudice, discrimination, harassment, and violence against trans people, I think the number one priority has got to be to make them feel safe, secure, valued, and accepted. We have to tackle the incredible anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, self-harm that a lot of trans people suffer because of the way they're treated. That, to me, is the number one priority. And I think, making this change is something new. It is quite a radical, revolutionary thing. But as we become more aware of issues, I think society needs to adapt, and the law does too.
What's your view of the non-violent direct action program, Extinction Rebellion?
Did everybody hear that? What's my view on the Extinction Rebellion protests? Well, clearly, we do face a climate emergency. And clearly, although the government has taken some action, it's nowhere near enough. And we're reaching a point where we could tip over into irreversible climate destruction. And the consequences for Britain and for other countries is so vast, so enormous, that we cannot possibly allow that risk to happen. Now, there have been lobbying and protests in the past. They've got pretty much nowhere. I think that using direct action, non-violent direct action, is a legitimate tactic when there is an overwhelming, urgent need. Let's just give an example. If current climate destruction continues at the same sort of pace, we are likely to see, by the end of the century, if not earlier, a very significant rise in sea levels, possibly up to 1 metre. The consequences for this country is that significant parts, not large parts, but significant parts of this country will disappear under the waves. Some of our best agricultural land in Norfolk, Kent and Sussex will disappear. it'll just disappear under the waves. And we will lose food producing capacity. At least hundreds of thousands of people will find that their homes are subjected to flooding. They will have to move. They won't be able to sell their properties. They'll become destitute. They'll have to get new jobs. Where are these climate refugees going to go? And on a global scale, the first areas that are going to go under the waves are the richest food-producing delta regions in places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, and China. Those areas are going to disappear under the waves. They are some of the richest food-producing areas in the world. Without that food production, the global food supply will face dramatic consequences. And so, again, there will be, in that case, hundreds of millions of climate refugees with no homes and no jobs, no income. Where are they going to go? You know, the potential is so devastating for the world economy. So I think in these circumstances, these protests are entirely justified. I'm not too sure about, well, I don't really agree with the protests on the tube network because, after all, public transport is a way to help combat climate destruction. If you use public transport rather than private cars or taxis, that's a good thing. So I think that was probably a mistake, and most people in the Extinction Rebellion who were polled agreed that the action should not go ahead. But otherwise, I think the rest of the disruptions are reasonable. They are disruptive. I'm sorry about that. But they're nothing compared to the disruption that's going to happen if we don't act now. And I think whatever you think about Extinction Rebellion, it certainly has put the issue on the public agenda in a way that no other campaign has ever done. So I salute them. Anybody else?
Yes.
Oh,
Sorry, there's just one.
oh, okay, thank you. Sorry, you have to shout, sorry. I left the Labour Party in 2000. I've been a member for 22 years. I objected to the right-wing drift under Tony Blair. I was really upset that the previous year, 1999, Gordon Brown, the Chancellor, gave pensioners a miserly 75% increase in their pension at a time when the national insurance budget had a surplus of 7.5 billion. And I objected to the way in which Labour tried to rig the selection of a Labour mayoral candidate to stop Ken Livingstone being selected. I thought, this party isn't socialist, it isn't even democratic. So I left, well, somewhat reluctantly, after 22 years. But in 2004, I eventually decided to join the Green Party, and I'm still a member of the Green Party. But I am broadly supportive of Labour, and I do want to see Jeremy Corbyn elected as Prime Minister. He's not without criticism, but compared to Boris Johnson, he's miles and miles ahead. Go on, quick. Yeah. Well, I don't think there is institutional anti-Semitism in Labour. There is anti-Semitism, but it's not sanctioned by the leadership. And it is by a minority of people, most of whom are actually not Labour Party members. They're Labour Party supporters. And I think we do need to tackle anti-Semitism. And it's true, it does exist in Labour. But it also exists in the Tory party, and it's interesting that that hasn't been brought to light. I think we also need to ensure that legitimate criticism of Israel, Israel has a right to exist and Jewish people have a right to security, but legitimate criticism of Israel over the treatment of the Palestinian people is not anti-Semitism, as some people claim. I was a member of the Labour Party for 22 years. I never ever heard a single word of anti-Semitism. In fact, all I heard was support for the Jewish community. And I've known Jeremy Corbyn for over 40 years. I know in the 1970s and 80s, he was in the vanguard of the fight against anti-Semitism being promoted by the far-right National Front. When they were doing their anti-Semitic attacks and marches, he was there marching in support with the Jewish community. I think he has handled the whole row very, very badly. I'm extremely disappointed and angry, but I don't believe he's anti-Semitic, and I don't believe the Labour Party as an institution is. There are individual members, that's true, but mostly supporters. And of course we need to challenge that and oppose that. But I think the accusations have gone a bit out of control. You know, I don't think it's, people say it's widespread. That is not true, it is not widespread. There are, of course, people on Twitter who are anti-Semitic, who claim to be Labour supporters, and some even claim to be Labour members. But that is not the same as the Labour Party endorsing it. So that's my view. Yeah.
Sam?
Do you think your work with LGBTQ plus rights has had a negative impact on freedom of speech, and whether it's led to the increase we're seeing in political practice?
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I have actually defended religious fundamentalists who have opposed gay equality and been threatened with prosecution. So about 20 years ago, a Christian street preacher, Harry Hammond, in Bournemouth, was arrested when he held up a sign saying homosexuality is immoral. Now, of course, I do not agree with Harry Hammond, and I criticised him, but I was totally opposed to him being arrested and convicted for holding up that sign. He wasn't harassing the LGBT plus community. He wasn't threatening or menacing us. He was simply holding up a sign. And in a free society, he has a right to do that. So when it came to his announcement that he would appeal against the conviction, I offered to stand as a witness in his defence. And I was going to say, you know, I disagree with Harry Hammond, but he has a right to express his view peacefully and without threats and menaces, which is what he did. Harry Hammond was so homophobic, he didn't want me as a character witness. There have been other instances where I've stood against mostly Islamist extremists who've advocated killing women who have sex outside of marriage, killing LGBT plus people, killing Jews, and killing others. I believe that it was quite right for me and others to successfully get them no platform. Because if you incite violence, let alone murder, you lose your right to free speech. Free speech does not include the right to advocate the killing of other human beings. So over the years, I've probably helped get 20 or 30 Islamist extremists banned from speaking at universities. I've allowed and actually defended the right of Muslim speakers who've expressed a disagreement with homosexuality. I've defended their right to say that, but not those who incite murder. So that's how I balance the free speech and LGBT rights arguments.
What is your opinion, are you aware of the Chinese government's prosecutions against Muslims? If you are, what actions do you take?
Well, yeah, I'm sure most of you know that it's estimated that possibly up to 1 million Uyghur Muslims in China, in the outer regions, have been arrested and put in re-education camps. And that is clearly a violation of their human rights. I mean, even though I do not support religion myself, I will defend the right of people to hold religious views. So I've been involved in the campaign against that persecution. And I'm shocked that many Muslim organizations in this country do nothing to defend their Muslim brothers and sisters in China. I can't understand why they look the other way when this really serious persecution is taking place. And that, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg in China. I mean, China claims to be communist. It's no such thing. China is now a capitalist police state. It is run on basically capitalist lines where business models which are similar to the West apply, where there's huge inequalities between rich and poor, where there's a vast, vast level of corruption. If Mao Zedong was alive today, he'd be leading a new revolution against Xi Jinping and others. And I wish he was.
The BBC recently released a film that teaches children about at least 100
Could you shout?
The BBC recently released a film
question was, is it right that the BBC did a film about 100 plus gender identities? My own view is, if you make it too complicated, it may be technically correct, but it really does turn people off. It's like I use the term LGBT plus. You know, obviously I do support intersex rights and those who are curious and questioning and queer and everything, but I think the alphabet soup is getting a bit out of control. It's deflecting from the reality of focusing on the core issues. Now, language is important, I agree, and we want to be inclusive. But, you know, where do we stop? I've seen a version which has LGBT plus with 26 other categories after. You know, that is just ridiculous. Well, technically, it's fine, it's true. But if you have to spell out all those categories, and I think you're losing the focus on the core issues. The core issues are sexual orientation, gender identity, and those who are intersex. Those are the three core issues. I don't think it helps the cause when you go down this long, convoluted road.
Sorry, Peter, we are up to time. Peter has very kindly said that if you have any questions, you didn't get a chance to ask here, he will happily answer them afterwards. He will be in the foyer outside there, so if you'd like to ask a question, please just hang around there. I am sure you will join me in saying an enormous thank you to Peter for coming here today.
The motto is, don't accept the world as it is, dream of what it could be, and then help make it happen.
I think thank you, Peter, I think whatever ideas you've heard this week, whatever concepts you've engaged with, whether you've agreed with them or disagreed with them, I couldn't sum up what I would like you to take away from this week any better than that motto. And so with that in mind, thank you very much for listening so well over the last few days. Have a wonderful half term. You may go.
Can I just before you go, can I just say that if any of you are interested, please go to my foundation website, petertatchellfoundation.org. You'll see a whole range of different news releases, articles, comment pieces around lots of different issues, some of which may be relevant to your studies. And in the top right-hand corner, there's a little button which says Join Us. If you give us your email address, we will send you a weekly bulletin on a range of human rights issues. Some of them quite quirky and funny, some more serious. LGBT and other issues as well. So please go there. It's totally free. There's no charge. Sign up and become a part of our community. If any of you are really interested, there's a few flyers about my foundation here which you're free to take.
Thank you very much.